There was a little bit of an argument on Facebook yesterday about whether or not this weekend was about surviving veterans or only about those that had lost their lives. And somebody said, well, Veterans Day is for surviving veterans. And what are you going to do? One of the hardest things that we ever have to do is to confront the idea of war. And as much as we probably don't think of it this way, we live in a fairly warlike country. We've been in 20 wars in our existence in a little over 200 years. It's about one every 20 years since we've been in existence. There are very few nations on earth that can claim that kind of a legacy, in modern times anyway. And we see the idea of the warrior glorified, which I think is appropriate, but we also sometimes fail to look at the effects of being a warrior. What happens to the individual, what happens to the family, what happens to the culture when we send people off to war. And we always argue, there's never been a war that we've had that somebody didn't argue we shouldn't have had it. As clear-cut as many of them may seem. And history tends to lose some of that information. You know, we tend to look at certain times in our history, well, everyone was in agreement about this or that. And the truth is, we're never fully in agreement about anything, including whether or not to go to war. I think probably one of the best, if not the best places to go to learn about war is to our poets and our artists, because they look at war from a different standpoint. I want to share just a couple with you that have to do with war. This first one is by a poet named Thomas McGrath. It's called Ode for the American Dead in Asia. God love you now, if no one else will ever, corpse in the paddy or dead on a high hill, in the fine and ruinous summer of a war you never wanted. All your false flags were a bravery and ignorance, like grade school maps, colors of countries you would never see until that weekend in eternity, when laughing, well-armed, and perfectly ready to kill, the world and your brother, the safe commanders, sent you into your future. Oh, dead on a hill, dead in a paddy, leached and tumbled into a tomb of footnotes. We mourn a changeling, you. Hand-selled to poverty and drummed to war by distinguished masters whom you never knew. The bee that spins his metal from the sun, the shy mole drifting like a miner goes through the midnight earth, all happy creatures run, as strict as trains on rails, the circuits of blind instinct. Happy in your summer follies, you mind a culture that was mined for war. The state to mold you, the church to bless, and always the elders to confirm you in your ignorance. No scholar put on your thinking cap, nor warned that in dead seas fishes died in schools before inventing legs to walk the land. The rulers stuck a tennis racket in your hand, an ark against the flood. In time of change, courage is not enough. The blind mole dies, and you on your hill, who did not know the rules. Wet in the windy countries of the dawn, the lone crow skirls his dragged passage home, and God, whose sparrows fall aslant his gaze, like grace or confetti, blinks, and he is gone. And you are gone. Your scarecrow valor grows and rusts like early lilac, while the rose blossom blooms in Dakota and the stock exchange flowers. Roses, rents, all things conspire to crown your death with wreaths of living fire. And the public mourners come. The politic tear is cast in the forum. But in another year we will mourn you, whose fossil courage fills the limestone histories, brave, ignorant, amazed. dead in the rice paddies, dead on the nameless hills. We find that the people that go to war are generally in a certain age category, where, to quote the poet, they don't really understand what's going on. You know, and there's a recognition that if you ask 40-year-olds to go, they'd probably say no. I had two uncles that both served in the Marines, one in World War II in Europe and one in Korea. And the one in Korea, my Uncle Jack, who's still with us, he was an engineer. He would go on the beach before the beach landing with a metal detector to look for landmines. So he was the first one there. He went onto the beach that was being invaded before the rest of the soldiers landed in the amphibious landing. And he wouldn't really talk about that experience very often. Once he told a story. I used to bug him as a little kid. And finally, when I was about 14 or 15, no, actually I was older than that. It was the time when I was up for the draft. It was 1969, come to think of it. And if you remember, some of you may remember in that year they did a draft lottery. They did a couple of them, but that was the first one. And I was in college, on a college deferment, but all those were going away based on the lottery, to go, you know, about whether you go to Vietnam or not. And before the lottery, I was having a conversation with my two uncles at one of our family gatherings or something. And they were always the straight arrows, patriotic believers in this nation, you know, as far as I knew. And they took me aside and they said, "Listen, Jim, if you get a low number, go to Canada." And I couldn't have been more shocked. And my Uncle Jack then told me the story. He says, the very first mission I went on, when I got onto that beach, within 30 seconds, my best friend beside me was blown apart. That was the first action I saw. And he lost 60% of his hearing. There was shells going off around him. And my Uncle Bob, who was even more like Archie Bunker than Uncle Jack, I said, "Really? Canada?" He said, "Anything's better than going to war. There's no disgrace in avoiding war." And I couldn't believe that this was coming from them. As it turned out, I got a really high draft number, 349 out of 365. The fellow on this side of me in the next room got number 1. On the other side of me in the next room got number 2. And they were gone the following Monday. It's not that I don't honor those that went. I do. And if I'd have been drafted, I probably would have gone. It's not what this is about. It's about recognizing there's a difference between the decision and the experience. And it seems sometimes that those who makes the decisions either never had the experience or have somehow are in denial about it. Let me share another poem. And this is from the First Gulf War. It's by Coleman Barks. And it's called Becoming Milton. Milton, the airport driver, retired now from trucking, who ferried me from the Greensville-Spartanburg Airport to Athens last Sunday midnight at 2:30 a.m., tells me about his son, Tom, just back from the Gulf War. He's at Fort Stewart with the 102nd Mechanized, the first tank unit over the line, not a shot fired at them. His job was to check the Iraqi tanks that the airstrikes hit, hundreds of them. The boy had never even come up on a car accident here at home, 24 years old. Can you imagine what he lifted the lid of the tanks to find? 3 helmets with heads in them staring from the floor, and that's just one tank. He has screaming flashbacks, can't talk about it anymore. I just told him to be strong and put it out of his mind. With time, if you stay strong, those things go away. Okay, they'd find a bunker, one of those holes they hid in, and yell something in American and wait a minute, and then roll grenades in and check it and find 19 freshly killed guys, some 60, some 14, real thin. They were just too scared to move. He feels pretty bad about it, truthfully. All his yellow ribbon celebrating, it wasn't a war, really. I mean, he says it was just piles and piles of their bodies. Some of his friends got sick, started vomiting, and he had to walk back to the rear. Looks like to me it could have been worked out some other way. My boy came through okay, but he won't go back. I'll tell you that. He's getting out as soon as he can. First chance comes, he'll be in Greenville selling cars or fixing them. He's good at both. Pretty good carpenter, too. You know how I know? He'll tear the whole thing right out if it's not right and start over. There's some that'll look at a board that's not flush and say, shit, nail it. But he can't do that. Not Tom. Now, there are more people like Tom that come back from war than there are any that come back with the visible injuries. We know in 2009 and 2010, in the military service of the United States, more people died from suicide than combat injuries. So what's the point here? What am I talking about? How do we create a system that doesn't require that? How do we learn to move from living in fear to living in love, even if other people don't agree with us? And by living in love, I mean living from a sense of empowerment. And it's hard not to be afraid. Sometimes it seems like it doesn't make sense not to be afraid. 9/11. You know, there's barely a day in your life that you don't experience something that's caused by the fear of what happened that day. Some security measure, something. Can't get a part for your foreign car because it's stuck in customs, being screened. I had to wait 3 weeks for a part for my convertible top, coming from Germany. Well, you can't just let any package into the country. And I understand that. But then again, if we respond only from fear, what's the quality of life that we have? You know? And it's a tough question. I don't want that to happen again. I think we agree on that, but then the question is, what's the best way to get there? What does our spiritual teaching tell us? It tells us basically, it's perfect agreement with the Bible, as you reap, so shall you sow. Thank you. Let's try the other way. As you sow, so shall you reap. That's much better. Thank you. But I would also say it's the other way around too. That what the actions you take lead to your next thoughts. That one action leads to another. That one set of beliefs leads to a similar set of beliefs unfolding until something somewhere says, no, enough. Enough. How long do you stay in a hostile environment before you say, enough? Well, probably something has to do with the degree to which you can have some effect on that environment, or you can leave it. But we know that human beings make choices all the time that are not in their best interest, that are not based on wisdom, that are based on fear. It's hard to be wise and fearful at the same time. because fear calls forth a much different set of energies. There's a wonderful story, and I believe it's true. It was recounted by Joseph Chilton Pierce, who's a researcher and child development specialist. But he talks about this situation that occurred in the American West in about 1895 in the Dakota region. And there were a number of homesteaders out there on farms that were, and the farms were pretty large because it's pretty scraggly territory. There's not a whole lot you can grow there. And there was a woman and her husband, and they had their grandchild living with them. And the grandchild was a girl who was 8. And one evening, a group of men came by on horseback that had formed a posse because a maniacal, crazed murderer had escaped from the local jail. He had killed several people with an axe. And he escaped. So they came by to get the husband, say, "Get on your horse and come with us. We're going to go track this guy down." So the husband went. And the little girl, by the way, is the one telling this story later. She says, my grandmother and I, we ate the stew that had been cooked, and she had fed some of the men that came by, the riders, and they got back on their horses and went off into the night. And the little girl then and her grandmother went into bed, and she said, I slept in my grandmother's bed because I was so afraid. It was a one-room cabin, by the way. And she said, the little girl says, I remember sometime waking up and looking over my grandmother, who was turned toward me on her side, and just over her shoulder I could see this man with a crazed look in his eye, and he had an axe. He had come into the cabin. He said, my grandmother turned over. She said, my grandmother woke and looked at me and saw the look on my face. And something about the way my grandmother looked at me calmed me down. She said she turned over and looked at the man who was now holding the axe over his head threateningly. And she said, my friend, you look like you could use some stew. And the man his whole countenance just changed. His eyes softened, and he brought the axe down. And he sat at the table, and she fed him some stew. And she said what she realized that had caused that transformation later in life was that her grandmother simply loved the man. She had no fear. And his fear could not exist in the same space as her love. Now, when I hear a story like that, the first thing that pops into my mind is, why is that so rare? Why do we have to go back to 1895 to find a story like that? And we probably don't. But why is it that our default setting seems to still be, despite all our years of evolution, to fear? Because when fear meets fear, violence occurs. When fear meets true love, which is a full sense of empowerment, violence can't occur. Yet we don't trust that idea too well. I think I'll be on the safe side and just be afraid. I mean, try running for political office on love. Not only won't you get elected, you'll probably be incarcerated. Which is okay. I'm just saying that's where we are. The important thing is not to bemoan where we are. The important thing is to see where we are. What is the truth? And how am I going to live in this world? Joseph Campbell talks about the idea of how are you going to live in this world once you realize that you have wisdom and love within you. Are you going to live like a sheep or are you going to live like a tiger? And once you realize you're a tiger, because everybody is, then you got to look around and say, well, now I know I'm a tiger. How am I going to live with all these sheep? And the answer is you live with what is there. You see the tiger in them. But first you have to see it in yourself. Otherwise, if I see myself as a sheep and I see you as a tiger, I have no choice but to fear you. In the last half century, at least twice, we have ridden to war on lies that could only exist because people were afraid. Documented history, no question about it. Vietnam and the war in Iraq. We know we were lied to. And yet, now with Iran, 58% of Americans think we should use force against Iran. And I'm not saying right, wrong, or indifferent. I'm just saying notice. Notice. Is it any different than the woman in an abusive relationship that finally gets out and then finds another guy who beats her up too? Is there any difference in those two dynamics? Because if you don't transform, you continue to do the same things you've done before. And I will share with you with this. It doesn't do any good to feel superior to those who make lesser decisions. Because if I approach you with a sense of superiority, how likely are you to change? See, the reason that man put down the axe was because he saw he was loved in that moment. And once someone is no longer an other to you, you cannot harm them. Kind of interesting. What I talk about here every week is some form of recognize that we are all one. Recognize that you have access to all of the power, all of the love, all of the wisdom in the universe. And I know that you must like that message because here you are. And I know when I was in those seats in my formative years in this teaching, I ate that message up. But when I walk through the door, I used to ask myself sometimes, how much of that message am I carrying with me beyond this room? Not in what I wish my life was like, but in what it really is like. What do I stand for if you were looking at me from my behavior in life? What do I really believe? And the only way to tell what someone really believes is to see how they live their lives. Do I live it in fear? Or do I live it from a sense of empowerment? Which doesn't mean you're never in fear. It just means that you have the courage to carry through because you know there's more going on than meets the eye. That old woman that rolled over in that bed and confronted that crazed axe murderer had a choice as to how to view that. Now, it's not a choice you can make in that instant. It's a choice that you make based on all the preparation up to that moment. If you've been telling yourself you're scared to death, scared to death, scared to death, you're not going to roll over and not be scared to death. So the decision that she made in that moment as to how to be was a decision that was made over a period of time by how she must have somehow come to see herself and her relationship to reality. Because that's what this is all about. How do you see yourself and your relationship to reality? Are you a frightened person living in a scary world? How do you see the world? How do you talk about the world when you're having conversation with people that aren't in this room now? Do you stand up for love as the only viable answer? I'm not saying war is never necessary. War is necessary as long as we have a collective consciousness that requires it. And when our collective consciousness doesn't require it, it will simply go away. Like the dial telephone. Like the buggy whip. I was going to say like corsets, but they're coming back. Like the plastic bag in L.A. County. It's illegal to carry your stuff in a plastic bag in L.A. County, although it doesn't apply to your personality or what you inject into your face. How do we get a ban on plastic bags in our culture? You make enough people afraid of them. And as long as we're getting things done by using fear, the world's going to go on the way it's going on. So I can't do much about the cosmic order of things. But I can sure determine how I'm going to live my own life. And how I'm going to strive to live from my own strength, from my own sense of the recognition that we are one, even if whoever I'm talking to or watching on TV or whatever refuses to accept that truth. I can't let my response be based on their consciousness anymore. That doesn't work. You can love them, but you don't have to agree with them. You don't have to give in to a lower consciousness ever. Now, I must say, if I were drafted today, I'd have the sense to go to Canada. That's the choice I would make today. Because I'm old enough to know better. We don't expect an 18 or 20 or 22-year-old to know better. Critical thinking doesn't evolve in the brain until you're in your late 20s. Which is why they have always gone after younger people. The ones that think they can do anything. The ones that will keep playing football even though they know the danger of a concussion. Same mentality, right? I'm invincible. When I was 19, I walked across a dam with the water flowing over it, with a 300-foot drop on this side, because someone told me I couldn't. What a dumbass thing to do. Because that's where you are when you're that age. That's perfectly normal for that age. To expect someone at that age to know better is to misunderstand. We have to know better, those of us that have been around. Those of us who make the decisions. Those of us who support the politicians who make the decisions. We have to stand up for what's right. To be a good citizen, to me, is only one thing: to insist on a politics of love. By simply, not by yelling at people, but by simply being that. Because if I tell you you're wrong, you stop listening to me. Have you noticed? So how can I just be an example of what I would, the best me I can be, whatever that is? And if you're attracted to it, you might emulate it and find the best you in yourself. And that's how we grow, and that's how we change. We don't grow and change by yelling at each other. We don't grow and change by negative political ads, but that just generate what they know is a fearful population. I refuse to be part of the fearful population anymore. I'm done. And if it means the end of me, it's the end of me. I don't think it does, quite frankly. We're in the middle of the nastiest campaign season ever. So we're told over and over and over, so we'll keep watching the media to find out who yelled at who today. Oh, look how outrageous. Oh, did you hear what Romney? Oh, did you hear what Obama said? Oh, look what he did when he was 7. All of which, by the way, is aimed at approximately 9% of the population and haven't made up their mind yet. Everybody else already knows. You could send in your ballot. Most of you could send in your ballot. You're not going to change between now and November. But it's that 9%. And you know, they did a study of those 9%. Just recently. And NBC did a poll of those 9% of people that are undecided. And this is not everybody in the 9%, but the majority of them are the angriest part of the population. Go figure. They don't like anybody. They don't like Democrats, they don't like Republicans, they don't like Ron Paul. Some of them like Ron Paul. They don't know what the hell he talks about, but they like him. Because he seems to not like anybody else either. But they're angry, disaffected. They feel like their lives are being messed up by people with more power than they have. And what comes to me is they could use a dose of the science of mind. Stop feeling, if you're feeling disempowered, you're missing the point. No one has power over you that you don't give them. So today, this weekend, I really want to honor and celebrate the sacrifice of everyone that has given in support of the ideals they believe in and continues to give. But I also don't want to be tricked into the idea that all of those sacrifices have been given under the best of orders. So much of that has been needless because it's come from fear. And it's time we evolved out of that idea. The best way to support the troops is not to have to send them to war. The best way not to have to send them to war is... The best way not to have to send them to war is to develop a true consciousness of love, where we don't make anyone the other. Because when you make someone the other, it's not long before they become your enemy. Thank you, and namaste. Another slide. Thank you all very much.